Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar on interactive read aloud. My name is Jill and I'll be hosting today's event. I'd now like to introduce you to Mr. Chris Brown, the Assistant Principal at Bacchus Marsh Primary School. Thank you and over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Jill, for that kind introduction, and welcome everyone wherever you are to this afternoon's Interactive Read Aloud webinar. A little bit of background, as you might have read, regarding myself. I'm a passionate literacy educator and teacher, and from the outset I really commend all of you on taking a specific interest in what I believe is a very powerful teaching practice that is critical to our repertoire in instruction in literacy. So today, the Interactive Read Aloud webinar, we're really looking at this particular technique as a powerful instructional context for sustaining the reading process and expanding thinking. It's a big picture thought, and it's a very, very powerful tool to be able to use within your literacy program. In terms of our learning intentions today, we have two of them, and in particular I'd like to support you in the process of selecting and planning interactive read aloud for specific purposes, and additionally to develop your capacity to use interactive read aloud to sustain the reading process and expand thinking. So two areas. One is the selection process and the planning, and the second is to develop your capacity in and around this particular instructional technique. Harking back to a very, very influential lady in reading instruction and reading research over the years, Marie Clay. I love this quote: "Let children hear text structures that expose them to language beyond their control." So much of what we do in classrooms when we talk about literacy is really based around the advocacy that we have for wonderful writers, wonderful texts, and it's our enthusiasm and our exposure to wonderful language that really can ignite children in terms of their love and passion for literacy. I love that graphic, the roots and the trees and everything growing from that. So we're going to expose them to language beyond their control. Current schools of thought in education talk a lot about our pedagogy, and interactive read aloud as an instructional technique fits beautifully within this gradual release of responsibility model. And I think here it's really, really important to think of literacy and instruction in literacy in the broadest possible sense. We have a very solid research base, and the research base suggests if we want to teach reading effectively, there are really 6 domains, and the domains involve oral language, phonemics and phonics, coming through to vocabulary development, reading fluency, and comprehension. Interactive read aloud fits very tightly within this gradual release of responsibility model, as does guided reading, which is our subsequent webinar, which I hope you can join us for next Thursday as well. So if we look at gradual release of responsibility as a model, and we think about interactive read aloud, we're really in this domain of I do it, where you're going to be doing a significant amount of modelling in this process, moving then to guided instruction, where the children will be able to do it. They will be able to undertake reading and engage in the reading process. Moving then to the collaborative, where we do it together, and the independent. Children read independently. If we look at the gradual release of responsibility, sometimes people can also think of it as a gradual acceptance of responsibility, and I think that's a wonderful turn of phrase. Interactive read aloud fits beautifully into this model. So what is it, and how is it different to other components of your literacy lesson or your literacy block? First and foremost, in an interactive read aloud, the teacher reads aloud to the students. It's not round robin reading. It's not shared performance reading. It's the teacher reading aloud to the students. It's wonderful to know today we have people sitting in our webinar audience from all levels, from primary to secondary, and I just want to make it really clear that the options in and around interactive read aloud are very, very broad across a range of texts, text types and text difficulty. The next element, teacher and students think about and talk about and respond to text. This is such a powerful component of this instructional technique, the thinking and the talk and the response. You as the teacher stop at key points to demonstrate text talk, also sometimes referred to as book talk, giving children book language, giving them academic language. Within an interactive read aloud, reader, teacher, and listeners, students are active. And that is a really, really important point. Interactive read aloud, reader, teacher, listeners, students. Then conversation. It's so vital to this process that there is rich opportunity for grounded conversation in and around a shared text. And finally, students are processing the language, ideas, and the meaning of the text. So it's really important that when we say interactive read aloud that we have shared understandings of this particular instructional context. Well, what's the value of IRA as an instructional context? The 10 or 15 minutes spent at the commencement of a literacy lesson is time well spent. Firstly, an interactive read aloud levels the playing field. What is meant by that? Because the teacher is doing the reading, the cognitive load of engaging with the text is something that you as a knowledgeable other is taking over. This frees up the capacity for every child in that class to be able to access that text. It's valuable in that you are modelling and offering experiences across a range of rich, interesting texts. So we can't ever forget the importance of interactive read aloud as a promotion of diversity across literature, across genre. An additional value is the age and grade appropriate choice can be made regardless of instructional reading level. In any classroom, we know we might have up to 4 or 5 years in terms of a spread. With your careful selection of an IRA, which you believe is age and grade appropriate, all children are going to be able to access that text. So the adjunct of that is that all students can think and talk about the text as the teacher does the reading. And that's the important point. All students think and talk because you've freed up the cognitive space for them to be able to do that. Really important, I think, in contemporary debate in education, what is the evidence base for embedding IRA into literacy teaching? Currently in Victoria, and I know we have a number of attendees this afternoon from Victoria, one document that's come through the Education State, the Victorian Department of Education, has focused on what's called the high impact teaching strategies, the HITs. There are 10 HITs, and I'd just like you to take a moment to look at the first 5 and the second 5 HITs and look at it through the lens of an interactive read aloud and consider what that instructional technique might provide in relation to these high impact teaching strategies. Each one of these strategies has a strong research base. So just take a moment to scan the key elements: setting goals, structuring lessons, explicit teaching, worked examples, and collaborative learning. If you scan the key elements at the bottom of each one of those high impact teaching strategies, I wonder if we can make any connections between the early definition and what we consider to be the value of an interactive read aloud. I'm looking at setting goals. You can focus on surface and or deep learning, structuring lessons, scaffolding, explicit teaching, shared learning intentions, teacher modelling, application of knowledge and skill, Worked examples. Teacher presents steps required to arrive at a solution so students' cognitive load is reduced and they can focus on the process. And the collaborative nature, students working together. Take a moment to look at 6, 7, 8, 9 and 10. Use the same lens. Interactive read aloud. How would it support these high-impact teaching strategies? As we explore this webinar, we'll look at the fact that an IRA, a quality IRA text, can be used on multiple occasions for different purposes. Your questioning is critical and needs to be planned and deliberate and strategic. Your feedback in relation to the IRA has to be based around a process, and we will come to the underpinning process for the IRA. Metacognition, giving students the language to be able to respond to text and engage in book talk. And differentiated teaching. Every child can come to that text from a different place, and with your support, they can access higher order thinking based on the direction that you take them. Many teachers in Victorian schools are experimenting with these high impact teaching strategies. So take a moment to think about which of these might apply to your experience of IRA. And if you haven't, it's a good place to start. So thinking about the process, thinking about reading in the broadest possible sense, I am going to now come to something that I think is absolutely critical to this whole process, and it's critical to developing your capacity in your classroom with your children or with your teaching teams. And that is that interactive read aloud supports thinking within, beyond and about text. This system of strategic action, known as the SOSA wheel, comes directly from the Foundas and Purnell work in and around the reading process. In any setting, in any school, it is absolutely critical that there is an understanding of what the reading process is. And as we move through this webinar, I'd like to elaborate on these systems of strategic actions as the absolute glue that hold your instruction together, and they will support the direction you take with your interactive read aloud. The top of that wheel refers to thinking within text. When we examine the reading process, these are some of the aspects that we will engage with within text. We'll look at concepts and vocab within the student capacity to understand, and within that domain, children will grasp literal meanings. We've mentioned that they are freed from the challenge of sustaining processing. You're doing the reading. You're negotiating the language. The discussion within text is going to help them identify key information to remember in summary form. And critical listening comprehension is built through daily IRAs. In that top half of the wheel, systems of strategic action, we're really referring to sustaining processing. Each one of these 12 strategic actions is defined, and it really is the glue for goal setting and the reading behaviours that you want to notice, teach and support. We have solving words, monitoring and correcting, searching for and using information, summarising, maintaining fluency and adjusting. When we move beyond the text in the lower half of the wheel, we're listening to and understanding together to make it easier to engage in inferential thinking. That's one of the strategic actions, inference. IRA offers opportunities for listeners to think about what is implied but is not stated. Students are involved in characters' lives, their motivations and their struggles. It supports demonstration of wider thinking, text to text, text to self and text to world. Each one of these systems of strategic action is defined. And here you'll see in this table a very crisp definition for each one. These definitions and each one of these strategic actions can really inform the direction you take with an interactive read aloud. And you can bring them to the uppermost in the child's mind or the reader's mind as a learning intention or a specific goal. And we'll come to that. And that last quadrant in the bottom half of the wheel, thinking about the text. This is the significant higher order thinking. We want children to be analytical and critical thinkers, to consider aspects of a writer's craft. You can demonstrate this thinking through your own talk and specific examples in a text. In most classrooms, this is probably the most challenging, because if you look at the first half of that wheel, the systems of strategic action, much of that is in and around the early phases of learning to read, where we're sustaining the processing. The bottom half of the wheel, thinking about and beyond, is where we're really getting students and readers of all ages to expand their thinking. Let's examine student and teacher roles within the IRA. We have our different domains before, during, and after. Like any instructional technique in a classroom, it needs to be built. And in building expectations and protocols around an IRA, here are some things to consider. Thinking of that gradual release of responsibility model, the student does come to that interactive read aloud with an active expectation that they will be thinking and they will be talking. For you, there's an expectation that you have selected and analysed the text. It's not the next big book on the shelf. It's not the text that I've used before and I know it goes well with this age group. We need to be a lot more sophisticated, a lot more strategic. So we have responsibilities as well as the students during, and this takes some training and some development. Thinking will be shared as pairs, as triads, whole group. Children need to be trained how to listen and respond respectfully. In powerful IRA classrooms, the children can then respectfully build on the comments of others. You have to rehearse and think through your opening remarks. What are you going to focus the thinking on? You actually need to rehearse your oral reading. And where are you going to think through your strategic pausing to promote dialogue? After, re-examine the text to think critically about the writer's craft. That's going to be the job of the child or the adolescent with your guidance. For the teacher, how are you going to facilitate further talk to make personal connections and consolidate meaning? Let's look at the structure. And within the structure, we'll get to a point where I'd like to do some modelling with a specific interactive read aloud so that this theoretical structure can come to life for you. So we select the text. Now we've just spoken about that. The text is selected for a particular purpose to accommodate the needs and the strategic direction that you want to take the readers in your class. Your introduction, your reading, your discussion, your response, and your rereading and revisitation of the text make up the 6 dimensions within that structure. I'll come back again to the system of strategic action. Your text selection, your introductory moves, and your teaching points are all embedded within this network of processing systems for reading. You may, most definitely, be operating in different domains within that system of strategic action. My advice in the early rollout of your understanding of an interactive read aloud is to work within one of those dimensions and then within one of the 12. To help you engage with the interactive read aloud, it can be a wonderful experience for you to select a specific strategic action, articulate that for your children and your readers, and then think really clearly about success criteria. what will that look like if I can actually engage with that strategic action? Again, from Fountas and Pinnell materials, the teaching and learning cycle is critical. We observe reading behaviour, we use behavioural evidence to infer strengths and needs in the processing system, and we teach. This webinar is not about the benchmark assessment system, the BAS, where we get instructional levels. The BAS is a wonderful tool to give us instructional levels and instructional direction. The BAS is designed to inform teaching. It's not about level land. It's about supporting readers, helping teachers with strategic direction, behaviours to notice, teach and support. The IRA becomes part of that process. Now, let's have a bit of fun with a real text. I've selected today a text, A Bus Called Heaven, which is a beautiful book by Bob Graham. I've selected the text based on observations of students and curriculum goals for developing readers. In my own setting, children in our grade 1 classes have had a focus on community as an inquiry-based topic. So I had a little bit of a look and thought, well, what might suit them? I'm lifting materials from another wonderful resource, and yes, this is a Pearson webinar, and yes, there are some brilliant Pearson resources at the moment. Literacy Classroom is one of them. A Literacy Classroom, which I'll speak a little bit more about, is a suite of literacy materials that will support interactive read-aloud, guided reading, shared performance reading, and independent reading. So this text, A Bus Called Heaven by Bob Graham, a wonderful Aussie author, is the text I've chosen for today's webinar. To prepare for the session, I think it's really valuable to get some additional support at the moment. I am advocating the fact that teachers use the continuum of literacy learning, again by Irene Fountas and Kay Pinnell, and another document, Teaching for Comprehending and Fluency, which I'll allude to at the end of the webinar. So, how do we structure the interactive read aloud? Got our selection and our introduction. This preparation for the session by reading and analysing the text and planning for embedding teaching is really critical. We have our opening, where we say a few words, engage students' interest and clarify some points. This is not to say that so many of you wonderful practitioners sitting there are saying, that's what I do. We've had many, many, many years of people who use picture books, big books, text excerpts for a whole range of different purposes. And people have done some wonderful work. The idea with an interactive read aloud is to formalise these different components and to embed them in the systems of strategic action. Again, going back to the Fountas and Pinnell materials, we can analyse what we do in our planning and our organisation. Just have a scan of this tool to look at what's important prior to reading A Bus Called Heaven. Just at a management level, that first point, are the students seated so they can hear well, and the text, if it's a picture book, is visible. Critically important in an interactive read aloud, holding the book. It may be on screen, it may be electronic, it may be digital. It needs to be visible, particularly the relationship between the text and the images. In front of you now, this is an example from Literacy Classroom at grade 1, and it's from the interactive read aloud component. This is the sort of guidance that you will get. And if I scan and I look at this particular overview, I can see a summary of this text, messages about community, which is my theme. People can work together to make their community better. With hard work and a little imagination, old things can be made new, useful and beautiful again. One person can make a big impact. We have goals related to inquiry, comprehension and communication. Then we have a very valuable section about this book. Its genre, how the book works, which is really important. The balance between text an illustration and the purposes in that relationship, and important text characteristics. I use this text with a grade 1 class, and most of us often think about vocab as part of the introduction. And I looked at this card and I looked at Tier 2 vocabulary, and I had to focus on two words here, abandoned and regulation. Now, if you were sitting in a grade 1 classroom, you would most definitely be saying that they probably wouldn't be part and parcel of grade 1 vocabulary. I asked students in that class to try and tell us a little bit about those words. Abandoned. Had one little boy that talked about abandoned and talked about something being banned. And we had a wonderful conversation about banned, something that you couldn't have anymore, couldn't use anymore, and someone built on that definition. And we got close. Regulation. There was a little girl who talked about to regulate something and said, I think it's something about a rule. So we had a platform to build immediately. Now, when we read in an interactive read aloud, you have to come to life. You have to make it enjoyable. You have to demonstrate fluency, phrasing, intonation, pausing, so as to interpret the meaning of the text. Pacing. You have to do a lot of noticing. Look at their eyes, look at their body language, and don't hesitate to have a no hands rule. Look at them. How are they thinking? Then plan your interactions very, very carefully. What is it that you're going to focus on? Have a look at those interactions for teaching points during the reading. We're going to take just individual comments, pair, triad, quad talk. What features of the text are you going to examine? What language structures, dialogue, dialect, writer's craft, illustrations. How often you pause for comment, prediction, question is important. This afternoon, I'll be doing more than would normally be the case, just to give you some examples of opportunities within this text. Listen carefully to the responses and invite others to build on the comments. Expand the language. Take the opportunity to broaden ideas. Within Literacy Classroom, teachers get additional support for this process. Ideally, we would be able to plan these interactions, but from an earlier standpoint where you're learning this craft, again, this resource will support you. Scan down to the bottom to this section of the support material and you'll see explicit reference to within, beyond and about the text. Thinking within the text, there's an abandoned bus which shows up outside Stella's house. The grown-ups clean the bus. A tow truck comes to take the bus. All clearly within the text. Children who can sustain processing will pick up that information. Beyond the text though. Stella is shy at first, but she gets more confident as the story goes on. This bus brings the community together. They spend time with each other on the bus. Stella is a hero for saving the bus. At no point does it say she's a hero. And about the text, it teaches a lesson about using your imagination and making your community better. All right, let's have a read. You're going to be my audience. If you have an elbow partner there and you have an opportunity to talk, I'd love you to turn and talk to your elbow partner. It might be a colleague, might be your dog or your cat, it might be someone special. But let's have some enjoyable time within an interactive read aloud. A Bus Called Heaven by Bob Graham. Abandoned, the bus appeared one morning from a sea of traffic, right outside Stella's house, where no bus should be, tired, old and sick. It had a hand-painted sign on it, held down with packing tape. The sign said Heaven. I'm turning my pages here at the same time. The bus brought change to Stella Street. Traffic slowed where no traffic had slowed before. People stopped and talked together. Just a little, but they talked. Stella changed too. She took her thumb from her mouth where it usually lived and said, "Mummy, that old bus is as sad as a whale on a beach." Then she pushed open the door and climbed on board. I wonder, how does this bus look different from the bus on the cover? Stella, the colour of moonlight, stood among the bottles, cans and trash. She was so pale you could almost see through her. "It could be ours," she whispered. "Whose?" asked Nikki, Vicky, Alex, Yasmin and Poe. "What did she say?" asked Mrs. Dimitros. "Ours," she said louder. "Well, whoever's it is, it needs to come off the road," said Stella's mum. And when Dad came home that afternoon, he found an old bus where the front yard used to be. "The wheels stick out onto the sidewalk," he said. "There are sure to be regulations." "Well, it's staying here," said Stella. "That's my regulation." Now, interestingly, at this point, if we paused, that discussion about a regulation as vocab prior to the reading of the text could be brought to life again. A regulation is a rule or law that tells how something should be done. This discussion can be had again with the children, partner, trio, or you might nominate children. Dad's worried that there is a city law about not blocking the sidewalk footpath. Next morning, Stella looked out her front window. People were sitting on the wall where no one had sat before. Under the bus were Esther, Rajat, Chelsea and Charles. "Mummy," said Stella, "I'm going out." And she joined them. That day, the bus settled in. Weeds nudged up around the tyres. Snails made silver trails, and a pair of sparrows nested in the old engine. While the children played, the grown-ups mopped and scrubbed and polished. Why do you think they are cleaning the bus? Elbow partner, turn and talk. Coming out of the read for a moment, at any stage where you pose a question, try and mix up the interaction, the collaborative interaction. And when students engage in turn and talk or partner talk, and we'll define those a little bit later as well, join in. Sit down and join in and try and grab a couple of pearls, a couple of really fascinating conversations to share. Love this part. That night, the bus got a bit of new paint. "Hello, boys," said Mum. "I've got an idea. Come back tomorrow and you can paint the whole bus. Make it sparkle." Now look at the wonderful opportunity in that text. Here come the graffiti artists, usually associated with vandalism. Could have a wonderful discussion about the street rats. Look at Mum touching them. Stella there, a bit scared, hanging onto the dressing gown. What a wonderful opportunity to integrate the illustration with the theme. Are they part of the community? Are they impacting on the community? Next morning, Stella drew a picture for the rats to copy. People came with donations. Poppy brought her goldfish. Luke gave a set of super comics. Stella carried in her table soccer with the missing goalie. Mrs. Stavros brought a bus cake. And Lucy lent her dog Bear for anyone who needed just to sit and pat something. Life returned to the old bus. Stella's fingers fluttered and her soccer players spun. Babies crawled. People laughed. Kids fought. Granddads scratched dogs. Meetings were planned. Couples met. And the Fingals showed their vacation pictures. With your prompts, you can be very open-ended as well. Don't drive at a response. For instance, here, a good question would be, what do you notice? What do you notice? Have a look at the immense amount of activity and action the relationships that are depicted by that beautiful illustration by Bob Graham. Look at the wonderful verbs: crawled, laughed, fought, scratched, planned, met. And look at the audience when the Fingals are showing their vacation pictures. Who hasn't been bored senseless by a film night? One Saturday morning, just outside Stella's house, there was music and dancing. There were picnics and laughter when a tow truck arrived. "It's against regulations," said the driver. "This bus is causing an obstruction." "He means it sticks out," Stella's dad whispered. "The bus has to go," said the driver. As the front wheels left the ground, snails dropped from under the bus and a twittering came from the old engine. We might pause again here. Prediction: do you think the people will get their bus back? Think about that twittering. I noted before I started this read aloud, twittering was also referred to as a potential piece of vocabulary because it's a key word in the context of this text. "Go where?" gasped the crowd. "To the junkyard," came the reply. Look at the richness of those illustrations. Wonderful opportunities for dialogue. Look at the font. "To the junkyard," came the reply. The crowd pleaded for their bus, but the junkyard boss came out to join the driver and shook his head. "This one's for the crusher." A little pink glow crept across Stella's cheek. 3 rescued snails were deep in her pocket. "Excuse me," she said. "Shall we play table soccer? You can have the only goalie, but if I win, we'll keep the bus." What a great opportunity here for a question. What do you think of Stella's plan to get the bus back? "And why," asked the junkyard boss, "tell me why should I play you for the bus?" "Because," replied Stella, "there are sparrows nesting in the engine." The game began. Handles spun, the ball smacked end to end, then goal! Stella scored. She followed that with 9 more and won. The boss put out his hand. "Joe," he said. "Stella," said Stella. They shook hands. Then Stella ran to the front of the bus. "Come and see," she said. "Chicks!" Amid the frantic flapping of the parent sparrow's wings, Joe, the junkyard boss, spoke quietly. "Better get your bus to somewhere safe, kid. Somewhere out of the way." "Thank you," said Stella, and the crowd cheered. "I know where we can take it." My apologies, I'm getting so excited. I haven't taken you with me. "I know where she can take it," said Stella. While the others pushed, she and Mum sat up front to steer, almost back to where they'd started from. And when the old bus came to rest at last, everyone else needed a rest too. Well, almost everyone. That evening in the vacant land, just behind Stella's house, music drifted high over the city, and the grass was danced flat around a bus called Heaven. As a full moon rose, 3 snails slid safely back under the tyres, and tomorrow Stella will see the sparrow chicks fly for the first time. Now, I did a lot more stopping, a lot more interactive thinking and dialogue within that text. It just gives you an idea of the scope within, beyond and about the text if you've thought through a quality text and you've thought through the purposes. What a beautiful story to engage children in the concept of community at many levels. The role of fluency, the way we read, is a very powerful component, and those of you that have been working with the benchmark assessment system will now really be familiar with the fact that there are 6 dimensions to fluency, and it's really important through an IRA that we can use those dimensions in the way we present, the way we read. Our pausing, our phrasing, our stress, our intonation and our rate, and how we integrate those elements is critical to the way you will present an IRA. After text, there are many options for you. You can have a dialogue, question, more aspects to think about and to notice. And it's critical within this phase that you can reflect on the dialogue, you can reflect on the thinking and consider what might be next for these students in this setting. There are a range of options at the end of text. Of course, dialogue is the most critical one. But to capture other elements, again, this support material will offer shared writing, interactive writing, model writing, and creative activities and tasks that might embed the learning. Whatever task you use for text response, again, use the lens that we've been talking through, because you may want to gather additional information about the strategic actions your readers are able to use and apply. Coming back to where we started, interactive read aloud and literature discussion abound with text talk, shared talk in which students examine ideas and think. Narrative, expository, poetic text. The more they have the chance to do it, the better they get at academic language used for text talk. And that is lifted directly from the Founderson-Pinnell Literacy Continuum, which is another document that we will look at. Turn and talk protocols are vital, and in any classroom you need those established. There are lots and lots of protocols that you can look at. Active listening, eye to eye, knee to knee. These key resources. The Founderson-Pinnell Literacy Continuum, I believe, is a fully fledged teaching approach, teaching manual, a methodological support network for teachers. Arranged in interactive read aloud as a continua by grade level and specifically focused on the 10 characteristics of text to inform your selection. It's a critical support in referencing and selecting goals to develop reading behaviour. A companion document, Teaching for Comprehending and Fluency. From the outset, when we talked about the systems of strategic action for thinking within, beyond and about text, within this text there are wonderful chapters, great chapter study materials for teachers and teams to take the learning to that level where you really examine those 12 systems of strategic action and how they play out within a range of instructional contexts. And Founderson-Pinnell Literacy Classroom. It's a wonderful support tool in relation to interactive read aloud to support the development of a bank of excellent IRA mentor texts. The one that was selected today, a bus called Heaven, came from the Grade 1 selection. And again, these IRA mentor texts have been selected because of their quality, and they do certainly support planning decisions and support existing curriculum mapping and planning in and around a range of different contexts, particularly suited to inquiry. And coming back to where we started, the system of strategic action underpins everything we do. And talk. Cannot overemphasize the importance of talk. The who, the what, and the how is critical. Interactive read aloud is all about expanding thinking through talk. These were our learning intentions. How to plan, how to select for interactive read aloud for different purposes, and to develop your capacity to use this technique to sustain the reading process and expand thinking. We're going to take a little bit of time now to look at questions and or reflections.
Thanks, Chris. That's been a wonderful presentation. For everyone who is attending, if you look to your right-hand side, you'll see a little box that says questions, and you can type your questions into there. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. I can see that we have a couple already, so let me just jump in and have a look.
In terms of the reciprocity between reading and writing, that's a wonderful point that's been raised. IRAs can offer a wonderful opportunity to link reading and writing. Mentor book, springboard writing. I think so much of the Founderson-Pinnell material and the system of strategic action really does make that really clear, so that if you looked at that particular text, where would you take it next in terms of that theme around community? The wonderful use of dialogue in that text where the author is suggesting that we might read between the lines. So most definitely great mentor text for reading and writing and establishing that reciprocity, particularly in and around writer's craft, author's craft.
So we've got another question that's come through, and it is asking how do we sign up for next week's webinar. So I'll pop the link in for you all to see, but just visit our literacy page at pearson.com.au. Okay, we've got Camilla who has asked a question. How long do you suggest the IRA part of the lesson should take?
Thanks, Camilla. Usually 10 to 15 minutes, and I know we can get carried away and we have to be quite disciplined. And we'll talk next webinar in relation to the literacy block, the literacy lesson. The IRA is really the springboard for the lesson before we go to other components. So in and around 10 or 15 minutes, again, depending on the text and your purpose. There is no compulsion to commence and finish an IRA within one session. You may take it over a number of days and certainly revisit it for different purposes.
I think there's another question that ties into that, which is how frequently would you do an IRA at different year levels?
Younger year levels, often we would rotate and alternate between shared performance reads for fluency and interactive reads to explore the systems of strategic action, expanding thinking components. At various levels, probably the gradient of, because with an IRA you are taking out the specific gradient of difficulty. My experience has been that lower levels shared performance read and IRA probably are looked at equitably, an equal distribution. Further up the grades, much more focused on IRA as the dominant technique at the start of the lesson.
Thanks, Chris. So we've just got some questions around getting access to the recording of the webinar after the event, and a lot of thank yous there, so thank you, Chris. So I will be sending out a link to the recording within 5 working days. You'll also be getting your certificate of attendance.
Just coming back to next week, for those of you that are going to be engaged in our follow-on webinar, guided reading next week, I'd love you to join that webinar. The interactive read aloud is a critical component of the instructional techniques that form part of a balanced literacy program. Guided reading is probably one of the most powerful elements and one of the most essential and integral aspects of quality differentiated teaching. So look forward to having people back next week as well so we can continue the discussion. So thanks again everyone for your participation, and I think if we can add interactive read aloud as a powerful instructional technique to your repertoire, that is going to be something that's going to be very, very important for you.
Thanks, Chris. And just before we sign off, Tracy's just sent a question. She apologises for missing the first few minutes. How closely does this model align with the Australian curriculum?
Very tightly. If you have a look at Australian curriculum documentation and you look at reading and viewing, what I find is that the outcomes that sit across our national curriculum sometimes need just that further fine-grained elaboration. And I think decision-making in and around teacher judgments related to curriculum, the whole notion of the systems of strategic action and what reading constitutes is really supported by this context and this technique. And I'd go back a stage again and refer back to the reading process and the systems of strategic action. Those 12 elements are of paramount importance in deciding anything to do with reading competency for our learners.
Great. Thank you, Chris. I think we've come to the end of our time together. Thank you once again for attending, and enjoy the rest of your evening.